Thank you, Stephen. Good morning all, and welcome to the Crop Nutrition Seminar. My name is Rosie Khan. I'm the Marketing, Communications and Agronomy Manager for Yara. Yara is a company that clearly understands the role that we can play to respond to the global challenges, and we strive to do so. Sustainable food security is a priority for us, with sustainable optimization as a main strategic focus. We are determined to be part of the solution and not the problem. Understanding the greenhouse gas emissions from production and from applications in the field, we have hugely lowered our carbon footprint of all our fertilizers. We have, I am proud to say, been developing and supplying British farmers with fertilizer products for over 170 years. We first made fertilizers here in 1843. We now need to produce as much food over the next 50 years as we have done in the last 10,000 years. Food production needs to be scaled up in a world which is already pushing the boundaries of nature and has the challenges of global warming with the limited resources of fresh water and available farmland. Incidentally, Yara has a global water initiative looking into how plant nutrients influence water use efficiency. We're developing the concept of a water footprint for fertilizers, and we've got the slogan of more crop per drop, but more about that you will hear in the future. Agricultural productivity is growing too slowly. To meet the future requirements for food, fiber, and fuel, this yield gap has got to be closed. Technological advances, including mineral fertilizers and high-yielding varieties, have been what has driven the significant yield increases we have seen since the 1960s and onwards. But we now have a yield plateau, particularly in wheat, although we're still seeing some increases in barley and oilseed yields. Substantial innovation is needed to achieve the required balance between the supply and the demand. That and an increased attention to detail approach to the crop management. The key is to grow more using less, minimizing the unit cost of production in economic and environmental terms. We need to identify best practice from a scientific point of view, further develop products, tools and solutions to deliver it. And then the great challenge, how we communicate and implement best practice down to the field. People who know me will be quite surprised to hear me say, thank God for Tim Berners-Lee, smartphones and social media, but with apps and other developments like that, we truly can bring guidance down to the field. But now to this crop nutrition seminar, which we are delighted to sponsor for the second year of CropTec. What a difference a year makes. We have seen much of the foresight report warnings coming to fruition. A reduction in the ag chems we have in our armory, a true understanding of the huge challenge of blackgrass to Eastern Counties farming operations, arable operations, the realization that some of the best varieties have the most susceptibilities, an across-the-board downwards move in price volatility. But it is volatility, and volatility goes both ways, and the long-term trend will be positive. And finally, dare I say it, perhaps too much short-term thinking. The fertilizer is one thing that is still working. All fertilizer is providing the balance between the nutrients that you have and the nutrients that the crop needs. Remote sensing technology, apps, and other tools bring diagnosis to the field, and lab analysis, vital lab analysis, times are getting quicker. A range of tools are now available to make timely decisions possible. We've always known that there's in-field variability, but now we have the ability to variably apply and to manage that variability. But are you doing sufficient checks and analysis to know exactly what you need? Plants need a balance of nutrients, not just the major N, P, and K, crucial as they are, and we have papers looking particularly at N and P in this seminar, but also the secondary nutrients of sulfur and calcium. But we mustn't forget the micronutrients and the role they play. And also in this seminar, we'll be looking at manganese, copper, zinc, and boron. Balanced nutrition will result in healthy plants, which are more resilient and better placed to withstand the pests and diseases that you have less chemistry to control. And so to our speakers. We've started a bit late, so we'll need to control the time very much, but we have 3 excellent speakers for you now, and I'd just like to introduce our first speaker, my colleague Ian Matz. Ian is a graduate of Newcastle University. He joined the UK agronomy team at Yara 8 years ago and is now the UK company agronomist. Ian is also agronomist to the Brixworth Farming Company. He does this in his spare time, plus a bit more. But this means that Ian really can bring the practical understanding of the farmer who can benefit from the knowledge that is being developed. So for his paper, Nutrition for Plant Health, I'd like to hand over to Ian. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie. As Rosie said, my name's Ian Matz, company agronomist at Yara. And the aim of this presentation is to take a slightly different look at nutrients to what we normally do. And as mentioned, look at nutrition for plant health. So I thought I'd start with this slide, and it may look like an atypical slide to start a crop nutrition presentation, but I can assure you it's not been mixed up with one from the crop protection seminar that's happening later on this morning. The real reason that I wanted to sort of start with this is just to highlight the reduction in efficacy that we've seen from some of the major fungicide actives over the last few years. You can see, without sort of really wanting to concentrate on the detail of it, the reduction that we've seen in septoria control from triazoles over the last decade or so. And this has really been mentioned already by Rosie and by Rob earlier, that this, combined with the recent EU laws on endocrine disruptors, which may mean potentially the loss of a lot of chemistry that we currently have available, means that we're gaining less chemistry than we're losing, and therefore more and more pressure is being put on plant protection products to help protect plants against the most yield-robbing diseases. The relevance of this from a crop nutrition perspective is that nutrition can have an important role in helping the plant's natural defense mechanisms, encouraging more healthy plants that are better able to withstand the pressures of pest and disease attack. Now, I appreciate this isn't actually a particularly new message, and as with a lot of things in agriculture, it's merely sort of coming around again. But apart from a few specific situations, like the link between manganese and powdery mildew, it's largely been sort of overlooked in recent years because of the strong performance of fungicides. So the role of nutrition in crop production tends to focus on the requirement of each nutrient for its role in improving crop yield primarily, but also improving quality. So things like oil content in oilseed rape, and protein content in cereals. In this respect, nutrients, as Rosie said, can be divided into separate subcategories. So the major nutrients, nitrogen, phosphate, and potash, required in the highest quantities, followed by the secondary, and then the micronutrients. And although the quantities of each can vary significantly, all have an important role to play, as a deficiency in any one nutrient, no matter how big its requirements are, can limit yield. And as a company, we've often tended to demonstrate this using Liebig's barrel, or Liebig's law of the minimum, which states that crop yield is limited by the nutrient that is in least supply. And this limitation has always been really focused on the limitation for crop growth, but it could also potentially be for plant health. So as I say, the aim of this presentation is really to discuss the role of nutrition from a plant health perspective, highlighting the interactions between nutrition and disease, and in particular the role that some of the key elements can play in ensuring plants remain in a healthy state and therefore better able to withstand pressures from pests and diseases. And as I say, this isn't a new message. It has been around for some time, and there's been a lot of literature studies looking at the reports on it, and some of them have been summarized in this table. It's also fair to say that there isn't a particularly clear message, especially with some of the nutrients like nitrogen. There's a large proportion of the reports that have been carried out help to decrease disease in plants, but also a large proportion increased as well. So the important ones really, which are shown in this table, that I'll focus on in a bit more detail, include potassium. There were 70% of the reports on potassium for the role in plant health led to a decrease in disease. Calcium and manganese around 80%, and copper, zinc, and also boron. So plant resistance to disease is genetically controlled, and this is really evident from the HDCA recommended list, which scores each variety for its resistance to the major diseases. But this genetic potential, just like yield and quality, can be considerably influenced by environmental factors, of which nutrition is a key one, and one which can be easily manipulated in agricultural situations. So providing nutrient sufficiency is the primary component for full expression of genetic resistance, but it's also the only control method available for many common diseases where genetic resistance is not available. Nutrition influences all of the components that affect disease severity, including the plant, the pathogen, and microbial growth. In order to complement disease and pest control methods, it's useful to know how nutrients affect disease resistance in plants. And there are two primary resistance mechanisms that nutrition can affect. Firstly is the formation of mechanical barriers. So in other words, the development of thicker cell walls or less permeable cell walls. This is important for fungal diseases because thinner, weaker cell walls can cause nutrients to leak from within the cells into the space between the cells, or the apoplast. And if this happens, it creates a fertile environment within this space that stimulates the germination of fungal spores on leaf and root surfaces. Secondly is the synthesis of defense compounds. These are things like phytoalexins, flavonoids, and antioxidants. And they're compounds that are naturally produced by plants that have a distinct fungistatic activity. Therefore, they provide some sort of protection against pathogens. Now, some of the nutrients that I'll mention have a role in either one of these two mechanisms, and some have a role in both. Of all the nutrients that affect plant pests and diseases, potassium is probably the most effective. It's a regulator of enzyme activity and is therefore involved in nearly all cellular functions that affect disease severity. And I showed of the 208 literature reports in the table a few slides ago that for the role of potassium on plant diseases, nearly 70% had a beneficial impact. And the majority of these came from trials where the level of soil potassium was recorded as being low. And these two graphs here are from that series of trials, really, which just sort of highlights what's going on, showing along the x-axis that as the potassium content increases within the plant, or as the potassium supply to the plants increases, it reduces the disease rating, or the degree of damage recorded on the plant, and subsequently increases the yield as well. So potassium is often simplistically linked to the strength of a plant through its role in regulating turgor pressure. But it's essential for the synthesis of proteins, starch, and cellulose in the plants. And it's the cellulose that's particularly important for helping fight against disease, as it is a component of cell walls. So potassium deficiency results in lower cellulose production, causing cell walls to become leaky, resulting in high sugar levels in the leaf apoplast, which creates this favorable environment for fungal spores that I mentioned. And recent results from Landcott laboratories have shown that nearly a third of all soils are below the target of an index 2- for potassium. And although soil analysis is a good starting point, it doesn't show the full picture, as the conditions during the spring can have a big impact on how much nutrient a crop is able to take out of the soil. And potassium is one nutrient in particular that suffers from dry conditions during the spring, because such large amounts are required on a daily basis during the periods of rapid growth. And this led to 87% of wheat plants and 85% of all seed rape plants being below the guideline levels in the tissue analysis from this spring. Manganese has long been known to contribute to the suppression of fungal and bacterial diseases, and is frequently linked, as I said at the start, with powdery mildew and also take-all. And the main reason for this link is down to the role of manganese in lignin formation. And like I just mentioned for potassium with cellulose, lignin is another component of cell walls. So again, it's another physical barrier to disease infection. And the table here shows the link between manganese and lignin, showing the relationship between manganese content of young wheat plants and the lignin content in the shoots and the roots. So as the manganese content increases, so too does the proportion of lignin. Boron is important for plants at times of rapid growth by either the roots or the shoots, so in the autumn and the spring for crops with a large demand, like oilseed rape. And a frequent symptom of boron deficiency is a development of corky tissue along leaf veins and stems as a result of irregular cell growth, or stem cracks in oilseed rape. These irregular cells are more loosely bound than normal cells, so they essentially produce wounds through which bacteria can enter. And in the study shown in the table at the bottom left, it shows the relationship between the boron status of wheat plants and the severity of powdery mildew infection. It just shows that the level of infection recorded in the boron deficient plant is several times higher than that recorded in the sufficient plant. And where boron was deficient, the fungus also spread more rapidly across the plant. And like we saw with potassium as well, boron is another nutrient which often comes up as being well below guideline levels in spring analysis. And 53% of wheat plants and 74% of oilseed rape plants were again below guideline levels last spring. Calcium is a nutrient that is commonly associated with health benefits, particularly in the fruit and veg sector. And the photo in the top right just shows the benefit of calcium applications on the skin finish of potatoes. And this graph at the bottom right shows the reduction in rotting in tomatoes as the calcium content increases. Calcium compounds play an essential role in the formation of healthy, stable cell walls, so again, improving the plant's physical barrier to disease infection. They also have an important role in inhibiting the formation of enzymes, which are produced by both bacteria and fungi. Now, the enzymes produced by these facilitate infection by dissolving the glue that bonds cells together. So by inhibiting their formation, again, helps to reduce infection. So the nutrients that I've covered so far are all those that have a role in helping increase the crop's physical barrier to disease entry. So nutrients, as I said, that are involved in the cell wall in some form. Some of these nutrients, as well as copper and zinc in particular, also have a role in the second mechanism that plants have to fight disease. So when a plant becomes infected by a fungus, its natural defenses are triggered. The infection causes increased production of fungus-inhibiting compounds, which are the phytoalexins and the flavonoids that I mentioned at the start. Now, both the production of these and the transport of these compounds around the plant is in large controlled by the nutrition. And in particular, copper and zinc, as I said, but also potassium, manganese, and boron. So shortages of these nutrients reduce the amount of natural antifungal compounds at the site of infection, increasing the plant's susceptibility to disease. Plants also respond to fungal infection by forming oxygen radicals and hydrogen peroxide, both of which help to fight infections as they're damaging to disease organisms, but they're also damaging to the tissue of the host plant. So nutrients like manganese, copper, and zinc help with play a role in their formation, but also help with the later detoxification, so not to adversely damage the plant. Now, trials looking into micronutrient applications are notoriously difficult to identify statistical significances because of the unrealistically large yield responses that are required to show above natural field variation. But there have been trials conducted, and the recent HGCA trials in particular showed that some very large responses can be observed. And the level of these responses is likely to be more than just down to their limitation on crop growth alone. So in this study, it was a 3-year trial looking at applications of manganese, copper, and zinc on 3 different soil types. We saw a maximum response from manganese of over half a ton a hectare, and this was on a light soil in 2010. There was also a 1.4 ton a hectare response to an application of copper on an organic soil in 2012, and a 0.7 ton a hectare response to a zinc application on a calcareous soil, again in 2010. Now, although the average from the trial series wasn't quite such a clear picture, these sorts of results that were shown within it just show some of the potentials that are possible given the correct situations. Now, nitrogen, as I mentioned at the start, nitrogen has an important but also a varied role to play in disease resistance. One of the most commonly assumed relationships of nitrogen to disease is that high rates of nitrogen leads to an increase in disease. And although to some extent this is true, optimum rates of nitrogen normally help to suppress disease. And this is either through the formation of various proteins and enzymes needed both for plant growth but also for disease resistance, or because vigorously growing plants often outgrow the most damaging effects of some diseases. But as nitrogen content increases beyond sufficient levels, the amount of antifungal compounds decreases, and this increases the risk of infection. But it also stimulates excessive, weak vegetative growth, which is favorable to disease and insect damage. Feeding intensity and reproduction by sucking insects tends to be higher on plants with higher amino acid contents, and this condition is typical of plants with a high level or a deficiency in potassium or zinc, but also ones with a high amount of nitrogen compared to the other two nutrients. Ensuring optimum nitrogen rates is therefore not only important from a yield and economic perspective, but also for plant health. And as optimum rates can vary greatly from season to season, as well as from field to field, and very often within field, as Daniel will come on to talk about in his topic afterwards, Yara has developed a number of tools, which we'll be demonstrating on the stand for the rest of the day, which help to better manage nitrogen rates according to the crop requirement during the season. So these are tools like N-Sensor, N-Tester, and the smartphone app Imageit, which is a good way of identifying the amount of nitrogen uptake from a field of oilseed rape using a smartphone. So in summary, through an understanding of the disease interactions with each specific nutrient, the effects on the plant, pathogen, and environment can be effectively modified to improve disease control, enhance production efficiency, and increase crop quality. Having highlighted a number of key elements required by plants to increase their disease resistance, it's important to state that no nutrient functions in isolation from others. As I mentioned at the beginning, all essential nutrients are required for the proper metabolic functioning of higher plants. So, for example, molybdenum, which I've not mentioned in this presentation, may only be required by plants in a very small quantity, but a deficiency in molybdenum can lead to a lower disease resistance by inhibiting the formation of nitrate reductase, which is an enzyme that converts nitrates to protein. And through some of the recent Yara trials, we've also seen that despite adequate soil levels of molybdenum, high applications of sulfur applied to a crop can reduce the plant's ability to take molybdenum out of the soil. So this really goes to highlight the benefit of balanced nutrition. As every season throws different challenges at us, we need to be able to better understand the state of the crops to know what is required to ensure they're not deficient in any nutrient. Although visual monitoring using tools such as the Yara Check-It app, which is effectively a library of deficiency photos for different crops, and it can be a very useful way of identifying deficiencies within a field, it's very possible that this has already led to a negative impact on crop growth or yield during the season. The main focus, therefore, for identifying nutritional weakness is in the area of hidden hunger, or the point at which limitations occur before any symptoms can be identified. And the starting point for this has got to be analysis. So understanding levels in the soils, combined with regular tissue analysis during the spring, is the best method of identifying potential issues before they can cause a problem. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Ian. Are there any burning questions for Ian? If I may, I'm just going to ask Ian. Ian, if you have 3 take-home messages that you would like people to remember. Sorry, the question.
Is the microphone just coming?
There we go.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, is there any particular importance to the timing of adding nutrients to plant while they're growing?
The key timing is really when the plants are growing rapidly, so generally in the autumn or the spring. But the best method would be to use analysis to identify when any nutrients become limiting. But generally, if it's just to be once, then generally it would be the spring.
Yeah, if I can just endorse what you said this morning, we did some trials this year in a wheat crop where we applied zinc in the autumn and saw a massive improvement in our plant health. It was a variety of Santiago, and as most people know, Santiago is pretty bad for rust. And in the spring at T0, expecting to find rust, absolutely clear, not a speck. And right through the growing season, we put a second application of trace elements on again at T0, and we found that our crop was incredibly clean. We suffered no disease at all in a variety of Santiago, which hasn't got the best track record for disease. So yeah, can only just endorse the true benefit of trace elements.
Excellent, and that wasn't a setup either.
Any more questions for Ian?
Sorry,
Ian, could you go ahead?
Sorry, if I can just put a yield to that.
Yes.
Our typical yield across the whole farm, which includes some loss yield due to blackgrass, some late drilled wheat after sugar beet, etc., was just short of 10 tonne. The field where we use trace elements, we had in excess of 12.5 tonne as a field average, and an increase in yield significantly.
Again, so that sort of yield increase is definitely not down to the requirement for, or the limitations for growth alone. So.
No more questions. Ian, my 3 take-home messages, please.
Well, firstly, it would probably have to be the fact that nutrition for crop growth is fairly well known and understood, but increasingly it's becoming important for plant health as well, and especially the micronutrients from that angle. Secondly would be the fact that nutrient requirements can vary greatly from season to season, from field to field and within field, as I've mentioned and Daniel mentioned as well in his talk. And in that sense, nitrogen is particularly important. So using the tools that are available and technology that's out there to help manage that variation is particularly important. And thirdly would be the use of analysis. So as I say, sort of using soil analysis in combination with tissue analysis to understand your starting point. Excellent.
Thank you very much, Ian. I'd now like to invite our second speaker to the stage, Dr. Anders Rangel. Anders studied agronomy in Colombia and then Germany, and he joined Yara 6 years ago to work on how to increase phosphate use efficiency from mineral fertilizers. From the 1st of December, I'm delighted that Anders is moving to the UK to develop micronutrient coatings for our products. Angus, come and talk to us about phosphate, making the most of phosphate.
Thank you, Rosie. Thanks for the invitation for the organizers, and thanks for you to be here and attending this presentation. The topic today is referring to our research during the last 25, 26 years with long-term trials and annual trials with farmers, trying to adapt new technologies, how to bring more for what you are using as fertilizers, how you can enhance the efficiency for what you are using and getting the most for these resources. As an outline for the presentation will be the importance in phosphorus and how is this related to sustainable yields, what are the current practices, what we are normally done in our farms or what we are doing. Also, how you can get a plant nutrition concept as an alternative form to apply fertilizers, in this case referring to phosphorus. And some of these results from these trials, how are the expected yields and what are the probabilities of obtaining these yields. So to bring the point of what is the importance of phosphorus in our system, in our production systems. So message for this, phosphorus is the energy to grow. If there is no phosphorus in the system, what you can see from the right side on the picture, there is no growth for the crops. This has also going on the tropics. If you will see the effect of a phosphorus deficiency for the maize crop in the tropics. So it's an energy factor to capture energy for all the process, especially for increasing cell division, so that means this is important for the establishment of the crop. It's important to improve the root growth, especially at early stages, and bring the plant to be established to make the job and get all the nutrients for the soils or the other resources that you have. It's a key aspect for photosynthesis, so that play also an important role of bringing the efficiency of other nutrients like nitrogen higher. It will promote flower initiation, tuber initiation in a potato. It will control also the starch synthesis, so it's also a control of the quality of the final product. And in some cases, it can bring maturity forwards, and this is important, especially for tropical areas where you need to crop 2 times in a year, and you are expecting just to crop with the rains because there is not too much irrigation system for the tropics. Where is this phosphorus stored in our soil? So if we can make a picture for the whole area of phosphorus in the soil, it's a huge amount, so it's going even up to 1,000 milligrams per kilogram. Unfortunately, it's locked in the soil, in the mineral area, or in the colloids. So the plants at the end is taking only 1% of the phosphorus that is in the soil solution. So they will start to grow as is normally, and then this P solution is getting reduced. So the main aspect of this soil that is contained there is to replace what the plants are taking during the crop season. So what you see is that this replacement is what we are measuring normally in the lab, so the capacity of the soil to replace what the plant is taking during the crop season. So what is the importance of this replacement? When we measure this replacement, what we can establish is a set of levels in the soil, and what is important to see from this picture for typical crops in England is that soils at the adequate level, or at the higher level, they are able to sustain the yield, to increase the yield, compared to soils that are at the low level. So that means that these soils are able to replace constantly what the plants are taking during the crop season. If we observe the situation from the actual situation from the soils in England, we see here the soil index from the low, index 0 will be very low, to index 6 to extremely high. And what we see is that there is a trend of moving the soils from the high or very high, from index 3, to the adequate level, index 2, and to the low level. So there is a strong increase in the low levels in the soil. Why? It's just a regulation. We are applying less P to the soils. It's a regulatory due to the environment. And this situation points out what we can do with our actual recommendation for phosphorus, especially for these low P levels, or for the adequate levels, how we can maintain that there. So what we learn is at the low level, or below the adequate level, we can that there is a yield increase, we apply phosphorus. We can apply phosphorus in a huge amount to bring again to the adequate level. I don't know how that painful is for the pocket, but with considering the amount of money that you need to invest and the amount of phosphorus that need to be applied to bring the soils there, that will be painful. So keep the soils at the adequate level, we'll also get something there. The adequate level can be maintained when you focus in applying what is the crop requirement. That is what we call the maintenance appliement. And soils are above this adequate level where the risk of environmental aspect, the risk of polluting water ponds are so strong. So for these soils, you can make a party for the phosphorus. You can try to reduce that. You can also use plants that are efficient of mobilizing phosphorus to bring that down. And at the end, what you will see is that this is what we normally make in the field. So this is the typical cereal crop. There is a base dressing, normally it's P and K applied in autumn, and then you have the typical top dressing of N at the spring, and then there is also a second top dressing or a third top dressing of nitrogen, even to bring more for the quality protein content or for higher yields areas. So in principle, what we can see here is that phosphorus and potassium are normally applied in autumn. What we know is that the phosphorus is getting locked in the soil quite fast, is react with the soil, and then that it will transfer to areas where are not available for the plant. So at the end, what we are reducing is the capacity of the soil and our applications to replace what the plants are taking. How this looks in a field experiment. So this is a low P soil, and this is a trial in Germany. What we did was, in this low P soil, we apply a huge amount of phosphorus to bring it to the adequate level. So what you can see at the zero level, there, zero application, is this gap between an adequate level and a low P level in the yield capacity. How sustainable is the yield? Now, which answers we can have for farmers or for soils that have this low P soil? If you apply P at different rates, what you can see is that there is a typical response to the P application. What you can also observe is that at the adequate level, applying P probably will not bring the yield higher, but it will maintain the P in the soil. It will maintain the level. The problem is how we can cope with these gaps, so which answer we can get for farms or soils that are at the low P level to bring also to the adequate with the same application rate. If we consider what happened with this strategy in a long-term trial, so what we see here is the relative yield increase for cereals in long-term trials in Germany and Austria. And what we observe is the typical response for the low level, so that is marked with the A there. The C level is what is adequate, and immediately what we see there is the response to the P application is extremely variable. So at low P levels, the application of phosphorus with the strategies that we have nowadays can fail. One of the arguments why this can fail is that you can also have trecent in these adequate levels or at the low P levels, you have more prone risk of the environment aspect. For example, temperature. So you can induce, you observe this induced deficiency of phosphorus at low temperatures, and this is a typical deficiency observed at early spring. So last year, the winter was extended, it was really cold, and what you observe in this is our farm, one of the long-term trials, and at the adequate level, you see the typical deficiency symptoms. How this reflect into the yield. On the top of this picture, these are plants that were applied with band application of phosphorus, and you see plants without this application. So we support the plant to bring that forward, and at the end, what you will see is that this is reflecting in the yield. So even at the adequate levels, if there is risk of environmental constraints like low temperature, drought in the case of the tropics, the efficiency of the soil to replace phosphorus to the plant is getting reduced, and you will see the deficiencies and a penalty in the yield. So the current strategies are based on soil management. So plants will absorb phosphorus from the soil. We need to keep that phosphorus in the soil, so we apply phosphorus to the soil either to increase it. So we don't focus in the crop. There is an increase in yield, but there is extremely variation, and there is also a penalty of the risk from the environment. So an alternative for that will be what happens if we focus in the crop. when the crop is taking the nutrients, when are the higher rates of uptake for every nutrient, and in this case, for phosphorus. Can that bring more efficiency for the crop? Can we detect these special times when the plant is requiring the nutrient and bring it that in the just in time? So it's just bringing that nutrient to the plant. So what we can see is how that reflects to a normal cereal crop. So we have the normal winter wheat is applied in October, will be the application of P and K like the traditional, and late N in the spring. But what we see here is that 70% of the P uptake is taken later after the tillering. During the tillering, the plants will make huge amount of roots, active roots, and these new roots are more active in taking phosphorus. So bringing phosphorus in this point will give a special shot of the plant to establish better and take more advantage of all the resources that are in the soil. So in principle, as a model, how that will make. So at the sowing, farmers can save this, probably will save also cost. If you bring this start application, this NPK, the balance system, at the tillering, when the roots are there, what you will see is that they will enhance the establishment. You have strong plants to support the whole system, and you can continue with the normal strategy of applying N. As a model is interesting, so how that reflects now to what we observe with farmers. So we have here, for 12 years, conducting annual trials, comparing the NPK application. In this case, we will see is the comparison of an NPK compound versus the traditional P and K application in autumn. And all of these are compared based on what the crop is required, so based on the crop removal. You will see also the results of our long-term trials, and these long-term trials are conducted with a typical rotation. So, for example, potato with winter cereal or winter spring, or in this case, corn, which is more important, is getting more important in Germany nowadays, and following also for cereals. The difference with the long-term trials is that we also check for the difference in the P fertilizer application strategy. So what happens when you apply this to the crop rotation? What happens if you apply this to half of the crop removal, or even 2 times of the crop removal, what was normally advised? How that picture looks here with winter wheat in England. You see here there is 12 trials. The difference between the autumn application and the spring application is if we concentrate from the average, there is an increase of 0.3 tons per hectare with a percentage of 4.16 for the spring application. How this reflect, for example, for these 280 trials in Germany for different crops. So what you see here on the left side in the axis is the probability of increasing yield for this spring application of an NPK compared to a PK application in autumn for all the different crops. So you see that there is crops that will respond better to the phosphorus application, like potatoes or spring barley. And what you see that there is also a difference between winter wheat in the first season and winter wheat after a cereal. This is also reflected to the capacity of each crop to mobilize phosphorus resources from the system. So in principle, what you will see is that this is the percentage of yield increase that you can have, or the potential yield increase that you can have for every crop in these annual trials. I want to point out that these winter wheat trials, the 133 trials, are trials from England. So in the long-term trials, as I commented before, this is the average yield and the medium soil P level for winter barley. So a crop that responds to phosphorus application. And here you have the strategy. So applying N and K in spring, or applying the traditional P and K in autumn and N in spring, and the response to P application rates, and what will be the application of NPK at the rate of crop removal. So what we observe is typical. Barley will respond to phosphorus application, and we will traditional make is applying P and K in autumn, and you get an increase in the yield. So that is something that is proved. The application in the spring, what is interesting, if you compare the application to the same rate, is also giving you a higher yield, but even applying less fertilizer can also give you a yield. So that depends, do I have the money to buy today the fertilizer? Can I make some holidays where I can do that? Can I make that with crops that respond better or respond less? So what you see is that there is a trend of responding to the phosphorus application, and you need to consider which crops respond to phosphorus to also put more if it is required. So that is what you will see here. For example, the 2 times application for this crop that responds to phosphorus application is also giving you an extra yield. What is interesting is that applying an efficient fertilizer to the same rate of crop removal, it brings you to the same level of a 2 times application. So if you compare how much phosphorus you apply for a crop barley in a year, that will be probably 32 to 35 kilograms P per hectare. In the 2 times will be 70 kilograms P per hectare. So if you apply the same amount that the crop is requiring, you can bring the yield higher. So in terms, so in percentage, that will be probably close to 9% increase in the yield. After 26 years of evaluating a crop, a rotation crop from potatoes that responds to phosphorus, winter barley that responds to phosphorus, wheat that is a plant that is able to mobilize resources from the system, and also at the high soil P level, in this case maize, for the rotations, what you will see is that comparing to the autumn application, you have a response close to 5% for the whole system. And in this case, you have a response to 1.5, probably 2% compared to the autumn application. So in principle, you are bringing with the same amount of phosphorus, but in this case, following when the crop is requiring the nutrient, you can bring the efficiency higher. And probably saving also money due to the cost of application, so you reduce one cost. So as a summary, an alternative is to know when the crop is requiring the nutrients and try to bring these nutrients there. So this nutritional status will give you an answer of what is the application rate and when is the right time to apply it. For that, you require also special fertilizers that can cope with a strong and rapid response to these necessities of the crop. So at the end, what you can have is a higher nutrient use efficiency. And you can probably increase your economic returns. You see that the probabilities are high to increase these returns. And you can reduce also production costs. All this is based on a research focus, is supported by long-term trials, is supported by annual trials with farmers in the conditions that you have. And in this case, what is important is the balanced nutrition will always bring forward your crop. And for that, you can also trust in the diagnostic tools. And the best diagnostic tool is your farm, is your crop.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Anders. Do we have any questions for Anders? Anders, do you have 3 quick take-home messages following your presentation, please?
what we learned today is that the yield potential at the adequate level is important. Maintaining soils at the adequate level will reduce the risk caused by the environment in the penalty of your yield. But there are alternatives for soils that are at the low P level to bring to the same yield capacity. And these alternatives are based on what the crops are requiring. So the crop is the best signal to focus, to learn which crops are efficient in mobilizing nutrients, and to learn when the crop requires the nutrient can give you an answer when to apply and how you can enhance the efficiency with this. A balanced nutrition at the early establishment of the crop will ensure a higher crop, a strong crop to support more the environment, to get the resources that are in your soil. So in this case, this balanced nutrition can give you a better answer also for the yield.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you. We now move on to our third speaker, Dr. Daniel Kindred. Daniel is a farmer's son from Suffolk. He did his first degree at Nottingham and his PhD at Reading University, where he was looking at hybrid wheats. He's the senior research scientist at ADAS Boxworth, working on nitrogen and yield. So the ideal person to talk about making the most of nitrogen, Daniel Kindred.
Okay, thank you very much, Rosie. And thank you to the organisers for inviting me today. And I also have to say thank you to HGCA, because HGCA, I work for ADAS, but today I'm really representing HGCA and HGCA work that, on nitrogen that we've been doing over the last 5 or 10 years. And really trying to share with you where we're at with our thoughts on nitrogen management. Okay, but I want us to start off by saying about the importance of yield. You may know that ADAS has set up what we call the Yield Enhancement Network with Yara and with a lot of the guys you'll see out in the room today, which is really about trying to energize farmers in the industry in terms of increasing yields, what we can do to increase yields, and testing new ideas, trying to do that. And part of that is a yield competition. And this is the winner of this year's competition, Tim Lammerman, who farms on the Lincolnshire Wolds. And this is his winning crop. And you can see he's got a new UK record yield there of 14.5 tonnes per hectare. Now, we're only going to ever be able to achieve yields that high by keeping our crops alive for longer. You know, this crop was still alive through most of July. You can see this photo taken on the 17th of July. And there were still 4 leaves completely green in that crop on the 17th of July. A lot of crops around the country this year, 17th of July, we're probably only a week away from harvest. You know, it's completely dead. And you'll only get to keep a canopy alive like that for that long if you have careful nutrient management. And you'll only do it if you have enough nitrogen available. So it's very, very important that we have good strategies and a good approach to knowing how much nitrogen we need for our crops on our farms. And really, this is what I want to talk about. This is what we believe the best approach to judging how much nitrogen you need on your farm is the Nitrogen Management Guide. So this is an HGCA publication that we produced in 2009. If you haven't got a copy of this, then we've got copies on the HGCA stand, which is over in the atrium over there. I'll be on the stand all day, and we can give this, and we can discuss this in more detail. So central to the thinking behind the Nitrogen Management Guide and how we can think about nitrogen management and how much nitrogen we need to be applying is consideration of 3 factors. So the first is crop demand. So how much nitrogen we need to actually get into our crop for it to achieve the yield and the protein that it needs to achieve. That's not quite right. The second is soil supply. So how much nitrogen is going to be available from our soils. That's going to depend on things like the previous crops, how much nitrogen we put on our previous crop, how much nitrogen that crop took away. Then how much of that nitrogen which is left from the autumn is still going to be available in the following spring, how the soil is going to leach that nitrogen, if we have a retentive soil or not, and how much overwinter rainfall we have. We also have to consider how much nitrogen is going to be made available by mineralisation. So if we've got a lot of soil organic matter in the soil, then potentially there's going to be a lot of nitrogen mineralised through the soil through the season. So that difference then between the nitrogen which is that the crop needs and what's supplied from the soil is what we've got to supply by fertiliser. But when we apply the fertiliser, not all of it's going to get into the crop. It's only generally kind of taken up with about a 30% efficiency. We lose some to the atmosphere, especially if we're using urea, we use a lot of ammonia. But most of the loss is really because that nitrogen's being locked up by bugs in the soil. It's being immobilised by bacteria in the soil, and it's not actually available to the crop. So the important thing is that we can then use, we can estimate each one of these three things. We can estimate crop nitrogen demand, we can estimate soil end supply, and we can estimate fertiliser requirement for your farm. And with those three things, crop nitrogen demand minus the soil end supply divided by the fertiliser recovery, that is your fertiliser nitrogen requirement for your farm, for your field, for your given situation. Okay, so the nitrogen management guide goes through the kind of steps of how we can actually go about judging each of those things. So we call the nitrogen management cycle. So how to judge that crop nitrogen demand? So basically your yield expectation times 23 kilos per tonne for a feed wheat, 25 kilos per tonne for a bread wheat. How to judge soil end supply? So considering previous crops, considering your soil, considering how much nitrogen, winter rainfall we've had, how much would have lost, and how much is likely to be available for mineralisation. That allows you to calculate your crop requirement. That allows you to also think about when we apply that, and then as we go through the season, there may be things we want to change as we get more information about that crop, so we can adjust our assessment of how much to apply. But the crucial point is that we then also need to monitor the success. We need to monitor how successful we've been in our nitrogen management. Because we need to then to know how good were our assessments of our crop nitrogen demand, of our soil end supply, of our fertiliser recovery. That's a really crucial bit. And I think that's a bit that we haven't really been able to bottom out exactly how to support you in that. The best we have is grain protein content. You know, if your grain protein content is about 11%, it means on average you're getting, for a feed wheat, that you're getting your nitrogen management about right. But we know that that's very crude, and it's actually very variable on a field-to-field basis. You can only use it as an average for the whole farm across years. Okay. So we've really had to start thinking a bit more about where the variation in nitrogen requirements really sit. You know, at what scale is it really does the variation in nitrogen requirements that we see really exist? At which scale should we really be focusing our attentions? Is it, you know, between season this year? Is it this year versus last year? Between regions, you know, Scotland tends to have different end responses to England. Between farms, perhaps your farm is different to your neighbour's farm. You know, you'll have been growing different rotations, different management, different farming philosophy, achieving different yields, different nitrogen inputs, different other inputs throughout time. So it's conceivable there's quite big differences between your farm and your neighbour's farm. Between fields, that's what we've always looked at. You know, nitrogen response experiments have been on a field basis, but they've always been confounded by everything else. We can't just compare fields fairly, because the season's always different, or the variety is different, or the farm is different. And also looking at variation within fields, which is where variable rate nitrogen application, that kind of thing, really comes into its own. So if we look at that within farm variation, the best data that we have is from the Mauna project, which was an HGCA linked project conducted from 2007 to 2009. This is working with farmers from Cam Grain and Fen Grain, and where we looked at the protein. It was a protein prediction project, but we got information on the protein contents achieved by those farms from 2 fields per year across those 3 years. And what we see is that there are some farms which are consistently achieving 13% protein. There are other farms that are consistently not achieving close to the, they're achieving 10 or 11% protein. And if you look at it, there's nothing that really underlying explains that variation. It's not that these farms are better farmers and those farms are worse farmers, or that the farms over there are achieving much higher yields than the farms over here, or that these farms are putting a lot more nitrogen on than the farms over here. There's nothing that kind of really explains the variation that we see there, other than the farm effect. So the implication is that these farms actually just need more nitrogen than the farms over here. So the other way around, that these farms, the farms that are achieving the lower protein content, actually it indicates that they're actually not putting enough nitrogen on, and they need to be putting more nitrogen on. Whereas these farms, already achieving sort of 13%, they could perhaps be pulling back their nitrogen applications. And so the important thing for you as a farmer is, where do you sit there? Are you, up at this end, and so actually you're consistently applying too much, or are you on the other end and perhaps you benefit by applying more? So if we look at within field variation, we've been doing some trials over the last 5 years in what we call the AutoN project that have really kind of transformed the way that we're thinking about nitrogen. The green area there is the size of what a normal nitrogen response experiment would look like. That's where we've traditionally got all of our information on how much nitrogen you should be applying. There's some trials which are that kind of size. But this project, AutoN project, which is basically a precision farming project about automating how much nitrogen we can using precision farming to tell us how much nitrogen we can be applying, and using the tools available. And this is, again, working with Yara and a whole load of, most of the active industry players, if you like, in precision farming. Again, most of whom are in the room. This has allowed us to do these chessboard trials. So that hasn't quite mapped onto the area there. But you can see the area there where we've got this chessboard trial. And that area is 5 hectares. So it's much, much bigger than what we'd normally be looking at in conventional trials. So what we do in these trials, well, we've now done 6 of them from between 2010 to 2012. And what we do is we get the farmer to apply, on one side of the tram line is applying 0 in one direction, the other side applying 100 kilos of nitrogen. Then we go back in the other direction, again applying 0 to one side, 200 kilos to the other side. So that builds up this pattern where we have 0, 100, 200, 300 kilos of nitrogen in a repeating pattern across the whole field. So each one of those is, like I say, about 4 or 5 hectares. Each one of those squares is 10 metres by 10 metres or 12 metres by 12 metres, depending on what the sprayer setup is. And you can see in each of those the response to nitrogen visually. You can see that where we haven't put nitrogen on, there's very little crop. But you can also see the underlying spatial variation in each one of those fields. Each field has got a different pattern of underlying spatial variation, which comes through very clearly. What we do with those fields, we combine each one of those plots with a plot combine, so we're getting good, accurate measure of yield and protein, and we also looking at other crop measurements. We can then Krieg that data, interpolate it, so we know what the yield would be on every one of those squares, and we can then fit a nitrogen response curve to every single one of those squares, one of those plots. So then we can calculate the optimum, we can calculate the yield at the optimum. We also calculate SNS. So if you look at the variation in yield that we actually see, I mean, you can see this, again, very big variation in yield across these fields. And the pattern's pretty much matching up with what we could see in the crops from the imagery. So this is the optimal yield. So if you'd put more nitrogen on the bluer bits, so blue is low, red is high. If you put any more nitrogen on the bluer bits, you wouldn't have increased the yield any further, or at least not economically. But in each of these fields, really generally seeing spatial variation of 3 tonnes a hectare in the optimal yield there. if you look at the variation in soil nitrogen supply, so this is the amount of nitrogen that got into an unfertilized crop. Again, we're seeing the same sort of patterns in terms of the variation. And big variation. So fields which you probably didn't expect to necessarily vary very much of the underlying amount of nitrogen available from the soil. But in each of those, seeing variation, generally more than 50 kilos a hectare and sometimes over 100 kilos a hectare difference in the soil nitrogen supply. So if we can combine those two things together, well, those two things together, combined with also a lot of variation in fertilizer recovery and variation in grain protein content, then contributes to the variation that we actually see in the calculated nitrogen requirements across those fields. And so again, we see that there's massive variation in the nitrogen requirements in these fields. So generally speaking, over 100 kilos, and often over 200 kilos, difference from one part of the field in how much nitrogen you should be applying compared to another part of the field. You know, some of these, we're getting responses above 360 kilos. 2011 was a very droughty year, and we basically got no response to nitrogen in that trial. Okay, so I think we've learned an awful lot from these trials. But I mean, the key things really are that there is just very high intra-field variation in all components of the nitrogen optimum, so including fertilizer recovery and including grain protein content. And we also see that yield tends to correlate with SNS, which perhaps to some extent means that we don't have a simple explanation in all cases for the variation in the final nitrogen requirement. We can't just sort of simply say that you can look at the greenness, say, and know what the effect on the nitrogen requirement is going to be, because yield, where the yield is higher, it's going to push the nitrogen requirement up. But where that yield is higher, we're also seeing a higher SNS, which brings the nitrogen requirement down. The other thing that it does is it gives us concerns about the way that our common standard way of doing nitrogen research, our normal plot experiments. Because if we'd have put our plot experiments in any one of those fields, we could have got a very, very, very different answer from putting it on one side of the field to another part of the field. But the other thing we've kind of taken from this is that this kind of experimentation, this kind of spatial experimentation, and working with precision farming type techniques, really is the only way of assessing soil type effects. We've never been able to really look at soil type effects in research before, and in terms of nitrogen management or anything else. All of the variation that we're seeing in these chessboard trials is due to variation in the soil. We don't understand that variation in the soil, but it's all something in the soil is causing those differences that we're seeing. And you've never been able to get that with normal plot research. And the other thing that these trials demonstrate is on-farm testing. The precision farming techniques, setting up trials like this, enables farmers to actually do this on farms. We're working very closely with the farmers who have set these trials up. It's demonstrating that approach, and enabling on-farm testing, I think, is a very important thing for the future, allowing you to do this on your farm. And that's what the Learn project is all about, which is a new HGCA project that we started last year, which is really about taking this kind of concept, but using yield mapping on combine to look at tramline comparisons. So we're working with, in this project, 17 farms over 4 seasons, and on each of these farms, we've got tramline trials across 3 fields. And the idea is that you have your standard N rate, but then on one tramline you put 60 kilos more than you would normally apply. On another tramline, you apply 60 kilos less than you normally apply. Then using yield mapping, we can see what the effect of you doing that on your farm actually really is. Now, 6 of these farms are doing this with plot experiments alongside, so we can really kind of look at we can validate this approach in comparison to plot experiments. And you can see, so this is an example of a field from this year here, where you can see actually where we put 60 kilos more on, there's very little difference to the standard, but actually where we put the 60 kilos less on is about half a tonne down. So implying that actually the standard application on that field was probably about right. You know, if it had put any less on, the chances are he was going to suffer by yield. So we've got this farms here, but what we're really saying is, you know, this is something that you can do on your farm. You know, if you've got yield mapping or just a yield monitor on your combine, just trying it out on your farm, 60 kilos more on, 60 kilos less on, should give you useful information in knowing whether you're getting your nitrogen management about right. But if you do that, we're keen to kind of keep in touch with you. So get in touch with me, email address there, if it's something that you're doing and something that you know, we share, if we can sort of share that data and learn together, really. Okay, so to summarise, we need to expect big variation in nitrogen responses. So both within fields, from farm to farm, season to season, you know, and this is what we hope the Learn project is really going to help us kind of get to quantifying the variation that, from those different levels and which one of those is the most important for us to really kind of concentrate on. It's possible that some farms are getting their nitrogen use consistently wrong. And the big question is, how can you check? The standard ways that we've always thought about before of using, you know, soil mineral nitrogen works, but it's expensive. You're not going to be able to do it on every field. Canopy colour, well, if you can see a difference in canopy colour, it's probably too late. Grain protein content, again, is probably the best measure we have, but it's crude. But really, the point is that precision farming technology, you know, enables this direct yield testing, enables you know, putting 60 kilos more on, 60 kilos less. I think is probably going to be the best way that we have to actually manage knowing whether we're getting our nitrogen management about right. Okay, thank you.
I'll just say a quick few words in conclusion. I hope what you've heard this morning is that balanced nutrition will result in healthy plants, more resilience, better placed to withstand the pests and the diseases you have now less chemistry to control. You have seen the plethora of work that is going on to increase the understanding of the role of nutrients. The many examples of the number of collaborations with the industry which are going on without much government support. And many of those companies are supporting this very important event here today. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And there are an increasing number of in-field diagnostic tools to bring the knowledge to you. We alone at Yara just have a few, which I'll just run through quickly. We can identify nutritional diseases from a library of photographs. You can measure the N uptake in oilseeds to produce an accurate application for the next application. You can check the compatibility of nutrients with the ag chems that you're proposing to use. And brochures and guides now can be on your smartphone. You don't need to have a book in the tractor cab or take a book to the field. And analysis turnaround times have hugely speeded up. So the conversation about plant nutrients, I hope, has started here. Anders and Ian will be available on our stand. Daniel, as he said, will be back on the HGCA stand. There's a huge number of companies here, and I hope you will have the time to go around and see them all. Thank you very much for attending this seminar, and have a good day. Thank you.